Thank you. Once again, a very good morning to you all. A very warm welcome to this important, if not, I would say auspicious, but given the kind of year we've had, and I won't use the word august like I'm a politician, but I must say it's a very nostalgic one for me, and I don't know what you think, given the year that we've had, the revival of Aggrey Klaaste's nation-building moral vision for South Africa. And when I think about just and I want to say to you, Jerome, and the Trust, thank you very much for the honor and the responsibility of making me a facilitator today. It was with a great deal of nervousness, I must say, knowing that I'd be surrounded by giants in the industry, activists who have led the way for us to be where we are today, and you'll meet those. Before I do that, perhaps it would be a good thing to introduce myself. My name is Tsepiso Makwetla. I am a broadcaster with the SABC. I'm a journalist. I'd like to think that. I have been for many years. In fact, in August, Jerome, I was rather taken aback to find, in fact, I was reminded that you have hit 20 years at the national broadcaster. And I was thinking about how 5 years before that, as I was at a commercial radio station, I said, it's 5 years now. You need to get out there and get ambitious. Little did I know what kind of ambition that would lead me to, and whether I should distinguish between steely determination and ambition. But I must say it's that kind of schooling, 20 years in the corridors of the South African National Broadcaster, that helps me appreciate the importance of such an event, the vision that the Aggrey Klaaste had, and you'll hear a little bit more about it. And in fact, I wanted to go back and read what it was saying in, I have an old battered volume of Editors Under Fire, and it says of this particular project, a different kind of people's project came from the editor of the Sowetan Aggrey Klaaste, who launched a drive among all black communities for nation building, a drive to restore people in African endeavor and to build from the roots a cooperative spirit which would combat the effects of poverty, violence, and the breakdown of traditional lifestyles and standards. And this, of course, was in the context of Teach, the programs that were built at the time to build the bridge between racial, cultural groupings and class. And this is why I was saying, just looking back at the kind of year we've had today as South Africa, where we were literally jolted into thinking about the role of the media and as a community building, and the vision we'd have for South Africa, that this is a very important event. And of course, we know that in a couple of days, it will be the anniversary of a Black Wednesday. It reminds me of a quote that says, there is no freedom without press freedom. But of course, within the context of the things that have happened this year, we have to ask ourselves, what is freedom? The shapes of forms that we understand freedom to be, the platforms from which it can be expressed when we talk about freedom of expression. But most importantly, when you look back to the time of Black Wednesday, when journalists were banned and imprisoned under the Terrorist Act, then I asked myself, what kind of terrorism stalks our communities, our collective communities at wide? And also I must ask this question, what kind of terrorism is then launched towards the media? Because those of us who are in the space know that as much as there's evolution of the media, there are also new forms of terrorism against it to gag us, to shut us down. But it's also time for introspection, and no doubt those conversations will happen. It makes me think of a quote by Thloloe, Henry David Thoreau, who said, if words were invented to hide thoughts, newspapers are an improvement to bad invention. And I ask myself this question, as the media space evolves, are there platforms, are the expressions of journalism that we are thinking about in this way? But I'm sure all of that will come from our very esteemed guests who will give you a better picture of why we're here. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you. Most of all, Mepinki, welcome. It is your journey as well. And to the Klaaste family, a very warm welcome to you as well. Colleagues who are joining us via live streaming, a warm welcome to you as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us here. It's going to be an education for people like me who somehow I think I stumbled upon this this profession. Somewhere along the line, I think I thought broadcasting was journalism. Lo and behold, there is a fine difference, and I'm glad that I've had the individuals here to learn from. And Jerome, you will also speak about your dabbling into this and how your father has been an example, but I know that the Klaaste was a beacon of hope for young black women and men and children, in knowing that as a society we can work together towards the truth and commit ourselves towards that. So without much ado, let me just call on the co-director of The Forge to say a few words, just to tell us a little bit more about this wonderful space that you have here. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Tsepiso. Thank you very much. Sanbonani, Molweni, Dumelang. On behalf of The Forge, a warm welcome to you all. My name is Makwetla. I'm the co-director of public programs here at The Forge, which is a space for the presentation and analysis of radical ideas from Pan-African, socialist, feminist, and other progressive perspectives. Greetings to our friends. Greetings to our friends here who are joining us in person, and greetings to our friends who are watching online over the Forge YouTube channel and who are listening to the voice of Wits. We thank all of you for joining us. Today, the Forge is honored to collaborate with the Aggrey Klaaste Trust and the voice of Wits in launching Aggrey Klaaste's concepts of nation building, so that this important vision can be rediscovered and re-established. This program is an innovation of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. It is an honor for us to collaborate in this highly significant project as we celebrate Bab Aggrey Klaaste's work in journalism during the difficult days of apartheid government in South Africa. Today's launch is appropriately taking place in October, this month marking the 44th anniversary of the darkest day for media freedom in South Africa's history, Black Wednesday, October 19, 1977, when journalists were detained, newspapers were banned, and black consciousness organizations and those affiliated to them were banned. Bab Aggrey Klaaste being among those detained on that Black Wednesday. Yesterday's announcement that the Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to two journalists emphasize the vital role played by journalists such as Klaaste and his colleagues and successors, who are prepared to risk their liberty and even their lives to defend freedom of expression and freedom of the press. We look forward to hearing our panelists discuss and explore Bab Klaaste's vision of nation building. It is indeed an honor to greet and welcome the panelist and facilitator. We greet and welcome Jerome Klaaste, the Executive Director of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. We welcome and we greet and welcome our colleague and comrade Anna Majavu, the trade unionist and journalist at New Frame, who will be joining us via Zoom. We greet Prof. Anton Harber, Caxton Professor of Journalism, Adjunct at the University of Witwatersrand. We greet and welcome Unomdai, Msomi, editor of the Sunday Times. And we greet Ubaba Wetu, Dr. Thloloe, veteran journalist and chairperson of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. Siyanamukela, siyanibingelela, welcome, feel at home. We also greet Tsepiso Makwetla, news anchor and current affairs anchor, at the South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC. Siyakubingelela Sisi. Thank you very much for agreeing to drive this program for us. We appreciate very much. Much appreciation to the panelists and facilitator for accepting the invitation. We also greet other family members of Ubab Klaaste who are here and other comrades of Ubab Klaaste. We also greet the junior Mrs. Klaaste, umama ubamsene no Jerome. So siyabingelela kakhulu sis. Sibingelela wonke umuntu. And I also want to quickly emphasize or reiterate our appreciation to Voice of Vets. These are the comrades we've been collaborating with also in putting this program together. And also greet our comrades who are doing the live stream, the good people of Between Productions, Dino and Thabo. Thank you very much. Thanks to all colleagues and comrades who are here. Much appreciation, and we look forward to this program. Sis, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Welelo, for inviting us to this brilliant space of yours. I know that there is a bookstore just across. I hope that it's open so that if your wallets are feeling a little heavy, you may want to empty them out there. As I mentioned earlier on, that it was with a great deal of trepidation that I accepted this invitation. In fact, I think I went back and forth with Jerome a number of times trying to find needle hole to just escape. I really tried. But I had my aunt, Commissioner Angie Makwetla, from whom Jerome and Mepinki, I bring her sincere apologies for being unable to attend due to ill health. And she wanted me to express her heartfelt, happiness at the fact that you are still continuing with this project and the legacy of Untitled Chapter and what they've been working on to infuse in the Black communities that sense of nation building through various forums and events that they've had together through Makwetla and Associates, that continues. But the revival of that, as she said, at this pivotal time and day this year when many of our communities are faced with the question of whether or not they are united in their poverty, in their lack of self-expression, in the sheer ability to openly express that which bugs them, if I were to use that term, because when we talk about freedom of expression today, I was thinking about how there has been over the years who are the media, who are journalists, practitioners, and as it grows, it seems as if even the arms of journalism have been weaponized, if we can call it that, against mainstream media. And it is a community eating itself up, and this is what she was expressing about what we saw, the events in July, that it hurts her, and she hopes that many more young people can learn from the work of the moral vision for nation building in South Africa by Untitled Chapter. So the next person that I would like to call onto the podium, I really don't want to say too much. I was reminding him that the last time I saw him was in a little room not far from here at the Mill Park Hotel, and there was an inquiry into the SABC, and we were talking obviously about censorship. How I found myself there, I had no idea, but I suppose having been there, as I mentioned, 20 years, somewhere along the line I would have been ensnared into supposedly knowing a word or two, but it gave us a great deal of hope that Thloloe was the one who was spearheading this project. And I just want to read from a quote. As I said, I was going through this battered version of mine of Editors Under Fire, of which Thloloe himself was a co-author. And you know, there was one section of it which said, The newspaper may be censored. We are not permitted to say where, how, or to what extent. And it is a feeling that I think a lot of journalists had at the time working at the public broadcaster. And it is good to know that we are constantly, as journalists and those who are watching the media, introspecting, navel-gazing, asking ourselves the important questions. And Dr. Thloloe, you were there to lead that. And you have distinguished yourself not only in the fight for where we are now, but you continue to do so by giving us your guidance and your wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to please welcome Ntate Joe Thloloe to give a word or two on this day, the mission, and what lies behind us. Please give him a warm round of applause. You can sit.
Tsepiso, Makwetla, Klaaste, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to be here talking about my friend, my brother, my colleague. He'd have been saying, "Ndinkosi yakho, ndingumadeba mna, ndingusopichi uvala bembenzele. Kodini ungabothetha nami njalo." That's what he'd be saying, and that's probably what he's saying from beyond our world. I got to know Aggrey very well. We started as journalists at about the same time. I started in 1961 at the World newspaper, and he joined us in 1962 after he had graduated from Wits here. So it's a long story that I can tell about Aggrey. But let me talk about today. Let me talk about what he wrote 33 years ago. It was in October 1986 when he said, he wrote the nation-building manifesto at Share World. He said, nation-building means picking up the pieces and rebuilding all structures that have collapsed in our communities. It means striving for the best in all that we do for ourselves and our people. It is a search for the acquisition and control of structures of power required for the survival of a nation. It is creating an efficient leadership and increasing the value and quality of life among all inhabitants of our country. We have a vision of a future society we want to create for ourselves and our children. Nation building is our hope for the future. 33 years ago, he said this. It is in the pamphlet that you have you received as you came in. I think it's on page 3. Can I request that don't just gloss over it. Don't say, I understand what he's saying. Can I make a request that we internalize the message. We become this message that Aggrey was raising 33 years ago. Now, I'll tell you, at the time, 1988, I was very cynical. He raised this question of a very big idea in a column he wrote, The Big Idea. And we tried to probe what he had in mind, and he was just groping all over the place. And I was saying, Aggrey, you need to clarify what you mean. And when he clarified it as a call for nation building, my cynical side came out fighting. We are trying to bring down the apartheid government. We are trying to pull down this building. And you are trying to say to us, we shouldn't pull it down. We should keep bits and pieces of it alive. We should maintain this monstrosity. Let's pull everything down, and we will start building from scratch once the apartheid government has collapsed. Now, there's a saying about prophets that they have no glory at their homes. Somebody picked it up. A manager at the Star picked it up, and he wrote Aggrey a note. I actually saw the note where he was saying, I was fascinated by your idea of a big idea. I'd love to work with you to develop it. And that was a man called Rory Wilson, who actually transferred from the Star, came back to become the manager at the Sowetan. So Aggrey's first disciple was a white man from the head office, and slowly he got to build people around him who believed in this idea. People like your aunt, Angie Makwetla, who became the face of nation building. I'm delighted that she is still part of the trustees of this revival, the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. He had people like Sam Mabe, who stood faithfully next to Aggrey. It was surprising how this idea grew from there, with so many people supporting it. Now, with hindsight, I can say very clearly that Aggrey saw through the rubble and the dust and saw beyond what we were seeing at the time. The things he was seeing, the things that he was talking about, were things that are happening today. We can talk very casually about the COVID pandemic, what it's doing to our nation today. We can talk about the corruption. I always get very amused when I talk about corruption, that the media that's been attacked from left to right is in fact the very vehicle that exposed the corruption in our country. Nobody knew that we had gone to these depths. We had gone to these lengths in our corruption. You open the newspaper today, you listen to a radio station, you watch television, and the stories you get are frightening. What happened to that vision that we as a nation had in 1994 when we said we were creating a new society? And it is because of the death of that vision that the Aggrey Klaaste Trust decided we need to revive Aggrey Klaaste's vision. We need to pick up the pieces. We need to rebuild our structures, these structures that have collapsed in our communities. The old sayings of Ubuntu have died. Today, everybody is looking at the size car that I will be able to get, the size house I will be able to get, and there is not much thought that goes into the ethics of getting what we want to get. And this vision that Aggrey had is a very rude reminder that we need to go back to the basics. Hence, the nation-building manifesto that we put forward today needs to be internalized by each and every citizen of this country. We need to live a new South Africa. Thank you.
And just listening to you is such a reminder of the kind of storytelling that I sometimes think is missing in our newsrooms, because sadly we have lost that connection with practitioners such as yourselves, people who are deeply rooted in, I think, what we can all recognize as a struggle that each and every South African who cared about the principles of democracy could really rally around behind. There may have been race and class divisions, but certainly when it comes to upholding of human rights and fighting laws that seek to subjugate us, it's that kind of storytelling that I sometimes think is missing in the newsroom. And I suppose this is why this is a revival of that vision of nation building. And I hope you'll forgive me for sitting down, because we are going to go on to a live stream now, and it feels a bit awkward, my standing and hovering over you when we are going to hand over to the next speaker in just a moment. But let me, before I do that, do stand now, because I realize that Jerome, I was going to move you down the program, which I suppose this was the time when you call time out on me and say, maybe you should go after all. Jerome, it must have been a very bright heat that you grew under. There's a lot to be said about trees and fruits and falling and the shade under which it grows, but it's good to see that it has driven you to not only be a trustee of this, the Aggrey Klaaste Trust, but through your own work, through Makwetla. I've seen some of the articles that you've written there, and the journalistic pieces that you've written about nation building through the teachings of your father, your family, and what you've seen in our nation, South Africa as a whole, and the globe, that you have decided to keep the mantle up and I'd imagine keep the baton moving for the next generation. I won't speak for you, I'll allow you to speak a little bit more to those who have joined us about the importance of this event and your role in it, and why each and every single one of us, as Untitled Chapter should say, that we should take the time to internalize and understand what this vision is all about. So, ladies and gentlemen, if I could please ask you to give Jerome Klaaste a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, my dear sister Tsepiso Makwetla. It is wonderful to have you here with us. We really appreciate you facilitating this watershed moment in our journey, and also representing our Deputy Chairperson, Me Makwetla, who is also like a mother to me. So thank you so much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for this marvelous opportunity to speak to you today about our journey, our nation-building journey at the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. So the Aggrey Klaaste Trust, in short AKT, is named after my father, Dr. Aggrey Klaaste, who was a famous journalist and crusading editor who shot to fame when he launched his groundbreaking nation-building philosophy in 1988 on the 22nd of October. Today, which is 33 years since then, and 17 years after Aggrey Klaaste's passing on the 19th of June 2004, the Aggrey Klaaste Trust, in partnership with The Forge and Wits University, is officially relaunching the Aggrey Klaaste nation-building philosophy in our country. This wonderful occasion simultaneously marks the launch of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. Before I go any further, I'd like to thank everyone who's helped us on our journey. It's been over 5 years since we've embarked on this journey to revive our father's moral vision of nation building. It has been a frightening, blissful, challenging, and rewarding experience all at once. Thank you to our esteemed Board of Trustees at the Aggrey Klaaste Trust, our Chairperson, Thloloe, our Deputy Chairs I've mentioned earlier, Me Makwetla, Dr. Tami Mazwai, Professor Anton Harber, and Me Dediso Caroline Klaaste, my mother, and of course Ntate Themba Madi. Even though the AKT is not a family trust, I've grown to view all our trustees as family. Thank you for putting your trust in us, and especially for supporting and mentoring me as the Executive Director of the Trust and the youngest board member of the Trust. Thank you to the many talented people who have worked hard to make today happen. The magnificent team at The Forge, led by Me Yvonne Phyllis and Ntate Moelela Cele. The splendid Wits University team, led by Professor Anton Harber and Me Shweshweku. A massive thank you to the many AKT partners, especially our trailblazing legal team, DM5 Incorporated, led by Me Lerado Matopo and Me Vele Mulangapuma. It is wonderful to have you walking alongside us on this nation-building journey. Thank you to the Sowetan newspaper, represented here today by the renowned former Sowetan editor and current editor of Sunday Times, Ntate Tsepiso Msomi. And thank you to our acclaimed panel of speakers, Ntate Thloloe, Professor Harber, Ntate Msomi, and of course Mrs. Anna Majavu joining us online. To the delightful Tsepiso Makwetla, we are eternally grateful to you. As I look around this room, I see many people who have influenced and guided us on our journey. I'd like to say thank you to all of you for all your help and all your support. A heartfelt thank you to the Klaaste family, to my remarkable mother, Me Caroline Dediso Klaaste. None of this would be possible without you, Me. Thank you for always carrying us and our father's legacy with the dignity and grace it respects. Thank you to all my dear older brothers and sisters, especially to you, Peter, for your unwavering support along our journey. Lastly, to Malahakwe Muleboheng Marumo, the love of my life. Thank you, Me, for everything you continue to do to make me the best version of myself. There's a ton of people I have not mentioned here, simply because time will not allow it. We deeply appreciate every single word of encouragement, gesture, and deed of kindness that you have shown us along our journey. Mudumi aletse handle. God bless you. One of my father's former colleagues once asked me how I was related to Aggrey Klaaste. I responded by saying that Aggrey Klaaste was my father. This person then asked me why I said he was my father and not he is my father. At the time, I did not understand his question. But after spending some time poring through my father's articles and columns, trying to get a better sense of who he was, what made him tick, and what influenced his nation-building thinking, I got to understand that that question was about legacy and how we remember those who have passed on, those who have left an indelible mark in our lives. We at the Aggrey Klaaste Trust remember my father, Ntate Aggrey Klaaste, by stepping into his footsteps and continuing his legacy of nation-building. Ntate Thloloe has read to you our manifesto. I think it is quite important that we do take it to heart, because it's also important to note that that manifesto was written 33 years ago, but it is still very relevant today. In a lot of ways, our country has regressed, and it is very evident that the time for nation building is now. So when we gathered ourselves as the trustees of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust, we felt it was important to maintain that manifesto that was originally initiated in 1988. We believe that our manifesto can be achieved through executing our nation-building programs that focus on the following key areas: community building, education, micro to emerging enterprise development, and storytelling through the publications arm of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. The flagship program of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust is called the Community Builder of the Year Awards. It's a national competition aimed at identifying and celebrating ordinary South Africans who are implementing extraordinary community-based projects to uplift their communities. We feel that these ordinary South Africans are the people who will be in the forefront of the struggle to rebuild our nation post-COVID-19. These South Africans, community builders as we call them, are doing work in fields such as education, entrepreneurship, human rights activism, crime prevention, social cohesion, and the environment, health, and sports and recreation. We believe that this program provides a practical way for us to execute our father's philosophy of nation building throughout our communities in South Africa. It offers ordinary South Africans the opportunity to shine as change agents, and in the same process, also inspire others. Finally, I'd like to say this has been a very difficult journey for us, especially for myself. Yes, me Makwetla, or Ois Makwetla, the light has been quite bright in following in my father's footsteps. But one thing that I had to understand earlier on is that we could not speak about nation building or Aggrey Klaaste if we did not understand him and the concept. So it was important for us to do our research, to read his columns and his articles. And in doing so, I was able to get over myself, so to speak, and understand that nation building was more than just about an individual. It was about all of us. It is about caring for people. And so in closing, I'd like to say to Ntate Madiba, Yem Velabambenzele, Sompichi, Ntate Klaaste, I hope that you are proud of us for the work that we've done today. I know that you'd be embarrassed by your name emblazoned on these pamphlets and on the banners as well. But I hope that you do forgive us, because it is all in the efforts to make sure that we breathe life into the nation building program once more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerome, and I'm sure he is indeed very proud and will forgive you those transgressions. I think it is many parents' dreams, maybe you'd agree, that your children go on to live those teachings. And as a journalist, it is often said that our lived experience is the important part of us, what we bring to the table through our journalism. But isn't it interesting that that lived experience is the one thing that endears you to people, but also alienates you against some, because they say, while serving others, you are betraying others, which is the complexity of being a journalist, that when you pick up those difficult issues that Ntate Thloloe was speaking about earlier on, bringing to light that which is undesirable, that you become the subject of ridicule of attack. But this is the mantle that we must take up, and somebody who will know more about that is Anna Majavu, trade unionist, researcher, journalist. She's been on a blacklist or two. In fact, I want to read something that you wrote in a piece, Anna, that you said, after all, it is morally outrageous that moral outrage should be used as an excuse to perpetuate the outrage of censorship of others. And I think as we find our ways through what is the meaning and purpose of journalism and how to use that power, it is a very important quality that Jerome spoke about, that getting over yourself, that sometimes we do tend to drink our own Kool-Aid and believe a lot in what we're saying, as opposed to concentrate on the storytelling of people who are damned to be excluded. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to call, she is joining us via live stream. Welcome to you, Anna. It's good to see you. It's over to you.
Had worked on the newspaper since the days of apartheid, and who held the vision of Aggrey Klaaste very close to their hearts. And sadly, during this time, the nation building program was also a bit downgraded. So 1 year later, when I was interviewing these retrenched and former Sowetan journalists and editors, they ended up telling me many interesting things, because my research was just into how did they experience the convergence. And what was very interesting was that they really foregrounded their previous participation in the nation building program as something that was as much of a devastating loss to them as losing their actual jobs. So I'll just talk a bit about what they told me, because they were the journalists who were, working with the nation building program for so long, and I think their lived experiences at that time are really important. So in summary, they said that they were attracted to working at Sowetan because of the nation building program, because it showed the importance that Sowetan attached to Black lives and the respect with which the newspaper treated the Black readership. And the nation building pages, according to the journalists, reinforced the idea that Black newspapers were not about the stereotype that whites or the apartheid government thought appealed to Black people. So it was not important for the journalists to write about fights at Shebeens. The newspaper was their own. That's a quote from one of the participants. The participants, who are the journalists and editors at Sowetan, also described the nation-building program as a form of advocacy journalism in action that championed pride and economic development for Black communities through an Ubuntu-based public and corporate partnerships concept. and further said that it set an example of the fulfillment that people could gain from giving brotherhood and sisterhood and unity a chance. When Tate Klaaste launched nation building, he himself said it was part of what he saw as Sowetans' primary aim to lead the way in repairing the damage apartheid had wrought on the structures within Black communities across the country. And as the panelists have said, this was actualized in a nation building manifesto that Sowetan published. One of the research participants described the way the project was connected to the newspaper and the journalists in this way. So I'll quote him. "The way I understood nation building was that we had to build our communities. We built people, we affirmed a lot of people because it became their voice. Nation building was the voice," end quote. The research found that participants felt strongly that part of their role as journalists was to work in collaboration with and in service to the broader community, and therefore that the nation building program was more than just a project aimed at highlighting and motivating for Black success. The nation building project also marked a political stand by Black journalists and editors against the misrepresentation and oppression of Black people by the media in general. Today, it's still very relevant. Obviously, we're 27 years post-apartheid, but there is still misrepresentation of Black life by the media. As the panelists have said, and as Jerome has hinted at in an article he did on Black Wednesday for New Frame 2 years ago, Black working class and poor do not get a lot of coverage about their lived experience. And today, we still have many structural problems that hamper nation building, such as the triple crisis of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Corruption in the public sector is clearly one of the main obstacles to nation building. And regarding inequality, the salary levels of CEOs are astronomical compared to the earnings of low-paid workers, let alone compared to the earnings of the millions who have no income at all. Journalism professor Simpiwe Sisante has written about how Tate Klaaste always believed that the nation-building program had to be run from the Sowetan as a place on the ground connected to grassroots people and not from a lofty office somewhere removed from the people. I think Tate Klaaste's idea of nation-building being run from a grassroots level is extremely relevant today. We can see now, especially as media practitioners, in the run-up to the local government elections next month, that the extent of state capture and corruption in municipal government has really been underestimated and undercovered. And this is probably just because there was so much coverage of the national corruption. But for example, if you look at a municipality like Makana, which is really just an example of many other municipalities, and this municipality includes the former Grahamstown, the town has pretty much collapsed. So there are large parts of the town that have no refuse removal, where there's only water once every 6 or 8 days. There's no street lights. There's sewage flowing freely, through streets, through people's houses, really everywhere. There's a complete absence of any attempts at nation building by the authorities. And it's led to a situation where affluent residents really are opting out of municipal services by introducing their own electricity and water systems and even their own sewerage systems. And so nation building on a local level has really come to mean community building, and it has really come to mean a situation where Black working class communities have to help each other access water, power, clean up dumping sites on their own, and even fill in potholes on their own. This is all, in towns like this is all really left up to Black working class communities. The participants, I think, have also alluded to the fact that on a national level and a political level, politicians tend to pay lip service to transformation and nation building. And we saw this week the DA's election posters that they put up in Phoenix, praising vigilantes who were responsible for racist murders recently. And these traumatized the families of the victims of those racist murders. And they really undermined nation building. So with this in mind, I think there is a need for the media as a whole to definitely revive Aggrey Klaaste's moral vision of nation building and to use that vision as the basis to create a common perspective or representation of what nation building is. because the media does not really have one idea of what nation building is. Often the media tends to represent an illusory kind of nation building. And this is the kind of nation building that happens when our unequal country is said to be coming together after a sports team has won a big event. And the media sometimes also wants nation building to represent a very sanitized transition from the old to the new, where journalists are just supposed to serve as a so-called neutral observers. Instead of this, I believe that, as Ntati Thloloe has said, we should rather, as media, internalize Aggrey Klaaste's message and see nation building as a struggle against poverty, unemployment, and inequality, where journalists are people who take a firm position against oppression, just as Aggrey Klaaste did. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Anna, and I'm sure there's no doubt in anybody's mind of why you were invited, sharing some very interesting insights there that I think I'd like to invite the audience and the panel to discuss for a few minutes, if you will all allow. If we could just get a roving mic around, or I could just pass mine on. If we have any questions or follow-up comments on what Anna was saying, Prof, I see you've got your mic in hand. Why don't we get you to switch it on and maybe say a word or two?
You want me to?
If you'd like to just comment. We're just taking questions and answers, and I thought maybe you may want to comment on what Anna's saying or some of what has been said. I know you're going to speak up next, but...
okay, separate from that.
Strike while you're hot.
So, Anna, I would like to ask you about the values you've referred to and the values we are reminded of that Aggrey Klaaste represented and promoted, and the Trust now is pursuing, and where you see their place in journalism. Let me say that, we discuss a lot issues of neutrality and partisanship in journalism, and we're normally discussing a kind of political partisanship. But don't we need to discuss partisanship in terms of the values you're talking about?
Anna? Please unmute yourself. Okay, sorry about that. We're just going to take the volume up. There we go.
Yes, I think that's correct. I think there's a place now, given the situation that we're in, for the media as a whole, not just Sowetan anymore, to adopt Aggrey Klaaste's values of nation building, non-racialism, and to actually everybody, the media doesn't really work like this. They compete, they've got corporate imperatives and so on. But in theory, it could come together and say, we support the values that the Trust has identified, that were always upheld by Aggrey Klaaste. Our aim is to rebuild the structures in all forms of our society and reknit the fabric of life that was shattered by apartheid and that has been further eroded by, the post-apartheid era. It's very Ubuntu based from what I can see, and it really, in some of the interviews Jerome has done, the Trust defines nation building as carrying on Aggrey Klaaste's mission to empower ordinary South Africans to improve their lot. And there are some interesting initiatives now. I don't mean to refer to Makanda all the time, but there is a citizens' front here that has come together that is contesting the elections. And if there hadn't been an election coming up soon, that front would have come together anyway and started working together to improve the lot of ordinary people on the ground. You find, everybody in that front from your pillars of the community, the elderly women who run food kitchens from their home, to university lecturers, to religious leaders, to people who run the soccer and netball associations in the townships. So they're all people who are very, very focused on nation building at a local level. And what we find in this town is they do get a lot of support from the local newspaper, which is Grokot's Mail, because they actually reflect the position of most of the people living here, which is what we want to see right now is that nation building. And we want people to be involved in it. We all want to play a part in it. So that probably doesn't answer your question very well, but I think if the trust can establish a really concrete definition of what nation building should be, and a way for the media to interact with that and support that could be very useful.
Okay, we're going to take some more questions, comments. Okay, we're going to, if I could please ask you to introduce yourself as well, and if there's anybody you'd like to pose a question to or make the comment to, you're welcome to say that.
Very good morning, Tsepiso, my sister. Dumela re Thloloe. Madumelo Untitled Chapter. To you, Prof, also hi. And now you know Sabona. Lilona, fellow panelist family, Medisa. My name is Tembas Potokele. I often pride myself as the young generation of Aggrey Klaaste. When I started journalism, I was interviewed by Thloloe when I was a student, and for me, in the 90s, to work for the Sowetan was a dream come true. Though I stayed there for 3 to 4 years, I later moved to the Star, I still have, that kind of connection with the Sowetan, more than the Star, where I've spent almost 11 years, but at the Sowetan. Precisely because of some of the things that Anna is alluding to, that Sowetan journalists felt that the concept of nation building was something very close and dear to their hearts. And to look at where they are now, it's I must say, it's quite painful, very, very painful. Not only them, but about the state of journalism on, print going down and stuff like that, and to tell you that most of them are really struggling. And I know I connect with a lot of them. I was with Braden Kumalo some 2 months ago at the unveiling of Pet Sebuku's tombstone, one of the great photographers. So one of the things that causes sleepless night, maybe the panelists, I would like you, because I've now sound like a stag record. I've moved from journalism, I went to government, I went to private sector, I'm in academia now, at Rhodes and at Peninsula Technical. And I've written about this thing, the state of journalism, who's teaching journalism today. We'll have some discussion, Prof, maybe on the side, because it's something that I've bemoaned, who's teaching journalism. Most of them have no industry experience. They might be professors with PhDs and masters, but none of them. I've spoken to most of my colleagues in academia, they are lacking. 2, what causes me sleepless night? But Joe, I've said it so many times. When I went to bookshops, like you just agreed to, we must go to a bookshop now, said we'll never find a book about black journalism. And I had requested many times, I even written columns, can we sit down and write a book about Aggrey Klaaste? I know a piece of Aggrey Klaaste because I work under him. For me, for a black journalism students or students who go and find a book about the doyen of black journalism, that thing will make me sleep peaceful. What you have narrated now, I've heard so many over again, but we need to put that in a form of booklet. And Prof, you are here. We need you, stay, you are here. We need you to help us. I've said to Jerome, I can't write it. I don't know Aggrey Klaaste. I know a bit of Aggrey Klaaste. There are people who know, so if all of us can contribute a chapter or so, that will make me sleep well at night. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to say something, raise a question, comment on what Temba was saying, perhaps? No. Well, I would also like to pose a question, and Anna mentioned about advocacy journalism in action, saying that there's a need for the media to revive Aggrey Klaaste's vision of nation building in our work. And I was wondering, you also spoke about neutrality or the illusion of it. You spoke about the upcoming local government elections, and there's a question I've been wondering: how much have we become like politicians, in the sense that we only go to the poor and rural areas to talk about their plight when it is time to vote? Have we become like the politicians that we claim to hold to account? Anybody, everybody.
This is very delicate ground we are walking in. But the truth is that the media are a reflection of the society in which they operate. We are chasing advertising revenue. So we look at the people that advertisers are interested in, and we look at them with the perception that the advertisers would want. I think in all the years I've been alive and I've been reading, look at any great writing anywhere in the world, you will find that writers are on the side of the downtrodden, on the side of the suffering. All the great writers. And that's where we as journalists belong. We should be able to say, here is a crisis in our land. There's poverty, there's unemployment, there's inequality. So we should be on the side of the suffering. That's why the slogan in the Union of Black Journalists used to be, we are black before we are journalists. And I know we are accused of being activist journalists, but ultimately we were ethical journalists. That's what is missing in our journalism today. That we are chasing the advertising buck.
Thank you so much, Ndade Thloloe. Thank you, Tsepiso, and Lindade Temba, and Mrs. Majavu as well. I just want to respond to Ndade Temba in regards to the issue of writing a book about Untitled Chapter. As I mentioned, one of the pillars in the AKT is a publications arm of the AKT, and we are currently working on publishing Untitled Chapter's book. But we felt it was important not just to look at his book as a biography. We have to explain why Aggrey Klaaste matters, why it's important. We're speaking about him today not because he was a great editor only, or that he was a well-respected academic. We're speaking about him because what made him special was the fact that he used his elevated position in society as an editor to put the interests of the others first. He used his position at the Sowetan to launch this philosophy of nation building about caring about others. And I think that is an important part of where we are starting, which is why we're here today, to launch nation building. And as time keeps going, we will be publishing those books. We're also looking at publishing a book of his articles and columns. And I think the book that we could work with you in future is in the book of essays, where we will have contributors, thought leaders in our country speak about Aggrey Klaaste from different angles, whether it's in business or whether it is in education or in the media as well. And then speaking to well, Mrs. Majavu, regarding her point on the definition of nation building, so that the media can can play a part, I think we could look at it in two ways. If we look at the whole system, nation building is about rebuilding broken down structures in our society. And these are structures, of course, like our small businesses. Recently, we had the lootings and the riots that happened. And some of those structures were obviously destroyed. We've got structures like our schools, especially in township areas where they are under-resourced. In rural areas, we hear stories of kids also dying in pit toilets. And that is also evidence of a serious problem that we have in that structure. So we need to rebuild that structure. And we also, of course, look at our churches. What is happening in our churches is an important structure within a society. So when we talk about nation building, we're talking about rebuilding those structures, and the media can play a very important role there, of course, because they can help us educate us, and they can also make sure that the grievances of the people on the ground, as Thloloe has mentioned, the suffering, the poor, the downtrodden, that their plights are heard, that they speak for the powerless. And I think the second part of that, as in the media industry, is that journalists individually can look to themselves. What kind of people do they want to be remembered as? Today we're celebrating the legacy of a great man because of his deeds. So also us all as individuals, as journalists, as writers, as artists, as business people, what sort of contribution are we making to our society? That a value of Ubuntu that you mentioned, we always need to ask ourselves, is what I'm contributing adding and contributing to nation building, or is it bringing someone down? So I think, yeah, that answers it.
Jerome, Professor Harber, I know you wanted to say something with Tsepiso. We'll also give you
yeah, maybe on, is this on? Yeah, on Themba's point, there is a tendency to just, and I'm not saying Themba is doing that, but to expect someone else to take the initiative to do what needs to be done. I agree with him. I'm one with those who say, when you go to journalism school, you don't learn much. I know I was in journalism school many years ago, but I think even the students I encounter now, you don't learn much about the black tradition in journalism. It's very few stories that you get. You talk about the drum generation, and basically that's it. There isn't much about the alternative press and what they did in the 70s and the 1980s. Those are the stories that we should be writing. Our generation should be doing that. I think that was one of the lessons that were coming from nation building, that we ought to take the initiative. Nation building also for journalists means starting to write about stories that will help build this nation going forward. On the issue of the media not talking for the downtrodden, I think part of the problem also is that we don't tend to mainstream black media. I mean, the Sowetan writes every day about what is happening in communities. They are there. They don't only write about communities when we are going into elections. Maybe big publications like the one that I met, maybe we are really influenced by commercial considerations to that extent, and we need to improve. But we need to also appreciate the fact that there are publications who do that, and we must treat them as mainstream and not treat them as if we are in an era where a black publication is not mainstream, but it's part of the minority.
for that, Tsepiso. And it actually raises the question about, we know funding, advertising, especially from government, it does tend to go to the bigger players. But when I think of community radio stations, which often have such a greater in-depth knowledge of what happens in communities, are often ignored. Even we as consumers don't go to them for that. So the knowledge sources existing is what I'm hearing you say, and that it's up to us to take the initiative. Professor Harber? Sure. Okay. So if we have one more question, even online, we are taking questions. Anybody? Okay. So we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to continue with the program.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The name is Themba Madi. I'm a trustee. Question to the panelists, and touching on what our esteemed editor from the Sunday Times was touching on. Is there still space for paper-based publications? Because what we're seeing right now is a serious travesty with regards to access to information by those that don't have smart technology, access to data, etc. They're being deprived from being able to access what it is that's taking place. So in light of the Trust's relationships with the likes of SANEF, the aim was to also extend our abilities to reach all corners of the country, and to ensure that we're able to help influence and get the voice out there to all publications, or as many publications that are able to reach the breadths that we can't, being based in the city as we are. So is there still, from your guys' perspective as media specialists, for written and paper-based media to continue publications? Because we talk about Sowetan right now. Sowetan is going through a serious change with regards to their business structure. We're not seeing that much of paper or physical paper being sold. People are not buying, and that is here. But how do we reach the breadth of our country and the breadth of our people and those that are really needing the intervention of sharing of information and the spread of the information? How do we then continue doing that going forward? Thank you.
Is there anybody in particular who'd like to respond to that? I could choose one. Professor Harber, would you like to entitle Thloloe as well afterwards?
Thank you very much, Themba. You ask a very large, difficult question that journalists and media people have been debating now for years, as we see the shrinkage of our newsrooms and our newspapers and the changes in our media. So let me just make a couple of remarks on what you've asked. It would seem to me that we have to shift from talking about whether it's print or online and say whatever medium conveys the information and the opinion, what matters is that it gets to people and we use the most effective way. It's true that print, I don't think print will ever disappear, but it no longer has the central position it used to have in conveying information as widely as possible. If you ask me what the central issue is around access to information, it's about the cost of data. To me, the biggest impediment to getting into sharing information and everyone having access to it is the cost of technology and data in particular. And that is something we should be thinking about and focusing our attention on, because that's the way, cost effectively, in the long run, we're going to reach the widest possible audience with the work we do as journalists.
I think Anton has answered the question for me. We shouldn't be clinging to the old. We know print is where we all come from. So we always hanker for the past. Technology has changed that world completely, and we should find ways in which we can reach every citizen using the technology that is available. And that puts the responsibility on government to provide the bandwidth that is necessary to provide the technology that is necessary. And it isn't that expensive. It's expensive because there are people who are making money out of it. But we need to look at more innovative ways of reaching every citizen.
Thank you, Untitled Thloloe. And I'm hoping, as we move on to the next part of our program, that you will also give a little bit more guidance or share your thoughts on, which is something that I hinted at in the beginning, and I probably shouldn't have done that, should have said it outright, to talk about the new forms of media and the conversation around journalist practitioners, who is and who isn't, because it all does drill down to the credibility of these news sources. It's part of the criticism in terms of credibility that has been thrown at those who impart information. And I'd like to understand that as we evolve within the media world, when we take into account freedom of expression and these principles of nation building, how do we navigate all of this? And to Tamba's point, it is very important, if we are going to build new knowledge sources, where's the funding going to come from? Do we have the funding? You talk about the infrastructure as well, Professor Harber. You know, in an unequal society such as us, those who need the information the most are not even in a position to improve that. So, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who still had questions, even online, please know that the program is not over yet. I think we've pretty much whet the appetite of those of you who were ruminating over some of these issues and the purpose of why we're here. Let me introduce to you Anton Harber, Executive Director of the Campaign for Free Expression of the Caxton, Adjunct Professor Journalism at the University of Witwatersrand. He's a media practitioner himself, teacher, former editor. He's done so many things, and I think he'll continue to share his thoughts on some of what we've been talking about and more. Thank you very much. A warm welcome to him, please.
Thank you very much. I've spoken a bit, so I'll keep what I have to say brief, so hopefully we can continue the conversation. Let me say I'm very honored to be here and greatly appreciate the link with AKT, the trust. When Jerome corralled me into joining the trustees, I must say I was very honored. I was one of those fortunate enough to work briefly with Dr. Klaaste, with Aggrey. And I will confirm what Joe indicated, which is that many were skeptical when he started to talk about nation building, because of the time in which it was happening. And I suppose because, well, you know, one was young and callow, and it took us a time to see how prescient, what a visionary ahead of his time he was in understanding the importance of building communities and reinforcing a sense of values for the long term, looking beyond the political transition that was coming, to building a new and different society. In thinking about the importance of nation building, I would emphasize a few aspects of it. For me, what was most important was to strengthen this idea that we need to build a nation, that we are locked together in our past, our present, and our future. You can't talk about the future of the poor without talking about the future of the rich. You can't talk about the future of black without talking about the future of whites, and the past and the present, but it's the present and the future we're focusing on. You can't talk about the future of Cape Townians without the future of Johannesburgers or the future of rural people. We are locked together in our past, our present, and our future, and we can only approach the difficulties, the issues, the challenges we face when we start from that idea, that concept, that belief that it's not, as you say, for somebody else to do. We are locked together, not just when we win sports games, but when we're grappling with the fundamental challenges that we know the society faces. I think that became very clear under COVID, where we saw many people reach out to help others, but we also saw how fragile our peace and our security and our sense of community is. We were all horrified in July when we saw again how fragile that sense of values and community can be, and the need to pay real attention to that. And I think one of the things when one reads about Dr. Klaaste is you realize that he saw that sense of nationhood growing from the building of communities. It was about recognizing what people were doing on the ground, not what politicians were saying noisily, but what communities and people in communities were doing on the ground to build that sense on which nationhood has to be built. The second thing I would emphasize is that everything you've been hearing is that it's rooted in a sense of values. And I think that's very important. And it's very important to us at Wits journalism. Because yes, you can teach people how to write and how to research and how to use the internet and how to use all the tools. But I don't believe we want to teach or spread or practice a neutral journalism. But for me, I'm talking about neutrality around values, not political partisanship, not factional journalism that supports one faction or another between and in parties, but journalism that is rooted in a sense of public service values and rebuilding that. Joe has talked about commercialism and the media, and we all live and grapple with that. But I think when we see the challenges journalism has faced in recent years, around the world and in our own country, to me it's about asserting that it has to be a journalism of values, and those values are based in a notion of public service, and rebuilding that. That sense that that's what we do as professional, working, trained, ethical journalists. It's based in those values, and the values being spread by the trust are terribly important to that. The third element that comes out for me is in this work what a critical, important role journalists have to play, can play, sometimes play, should play. And we all, as was mentioned earlier, heard the fantastic news that two great journalists won the Nobel Peace Prize yesterday. I only know one of them and her work reasonably well, and I can tell you it's fantastically deserved, and it's a triumph for that notion that journalism has such an important role to play when it's free and it's independent and it's based on the kinds of values we're talking about. So I really think that we have to rebuild our journalism by debating what those values are and what is important to us, and the central role that journalists have in tackling the many issues that we are grappling with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harber. And now let me introduce somebody that I too have looked up to entering. I know you can say whoa, because it's almost been in tandem, but you certainly were years ahead, and it is an honor, as I said, to be amongst people who have charted the way forward in the panelists here. Tsepiso Msomi is an author as well, former political editor at the City Press and Sunday Times, editor of the Sowetan, and he also has a wealth of knowledge to share on some of these challenges that we face. And I suppose also what we were thinking in the past would be challenges, some of which were unforeseen, and what we have to tackle now. So please give him a warm round of applause.
No, thank you very much. Thank you to the Klaaste family and the Trust for inviting me. I'm probably, amongst all the speakers, I'm probably the only one who never really face-to-face met with Mr. Klaaste, because I started my journalism in Durban when he was about to retire. And by the time I came up here, he was no longer a journalist. I would see him in functions, but he wasn't really with the Sowetan anymore. Yet his legacy at the newspaper really affected what the way I see journalism. I remember when I was appointed to be editor of the Sowetan, I had been at the Sunday Times for several years, and having worked at City Press also, but never had an opportunity to work for Sowetan. I'd worked with a number of other editors at the Sowetan, and then I met a former Sowetan staff member who says to me, "Do you realize that you are going to do Aggrey Klaaste's job?" And that really, really troubled me. I felt scared because of all the work that I used to see as a young man of what he was doing beyond just reporting. As a political journalist, we always looked up to journalists like Anton, Harber, Thloloe, people who were writing about politics. But it always touched me that he was going beyond what we saw as party political, as activist reporting, to the kind of activism that was talking about communities. So even his nation building project, you will read a newspaper, you will read the Sowetan, and you will feel that you were part of this project, even though there wasn't something that was direct that you were doing. I mean, I grew up in a community that had a lot of civic organizations. A lot of activism there had started as anti-apartheid, but over time it started drawing in to learning from the lessons of community building and people coming up with initiatives to say, what do we do for ourselves other than just protesting against what we are fighting against? And when I got to the Sowetan, I then learned something that I had not experienced at the other publications that I'd worked at. And it is directly because of his influence and legacy, where you will have people just walking into the newsroom without appointment to come and raise issues that they have, problems that they have, and they will expect the newspaper to help them with solutions. So it was not always about giving you a story to write in a publication, but it is about, please help us try and find a solution to the problem that we are facing. Unfortunately, it was at a time when we were going through a very difficult period as a publication at Sowetan because of financial problems, but also, I mean, the media industry as a whole. We're going through retrenchments. As Anna was talking about, offices having been moved from a place that was closer to the communities, to our readers, to Rosebank. But you'll have people traveling far, I mean, as far as Pretoria, to come to the publication to say these are the issues that we have. And I think that has been the strength of the Sowetan as a result throughout. That's why it remains relevant today. I know when you look at print and circulation, it's like all of us in the print industry, we've lost a lot of readers, but it's a brand that people continue to associate with. It's a brand that people still believe in, and I think it will live much longer, even beyond print. It will live online and in other platforms, as long as it continues with that tradition. So what I thought I should say here is that even though I'm no longer at the Sowetan, unfortunately my stint was very short. It wasn't that successful. It was 2 years. I had to move to what they thought I knew best, which is Sunday publications, because I'd been a Sunday journalist for most of my life. But I think there is willingness in the group now, especially after the change of ownership. There is willingness to find ways of assisting in this nation-building project. And I think we will need to sit down with the trust to see what other ways we can assist, whether it is through publicizing events, through hosting dialogues, and whatever else we can do, because I think there is that commitment that when we are in the newspaper business, when we are in the media business, it's not just about writing stories, it's not about selling content, it is also about assisting and building a better country. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Tsepiso. So anybody who would like to raise a question, or perhaps even online, and a comment from you as well, if you would like to. Okay, perhaps then I'll lead the way and ask Professor Harber this. You said something that I think a lot of people will relate to and agree with you, that we were horrified about what happened in July. And you were speaking about political transition and how the thinking really is that we are a nation, we are locked in as a nation, irrespective of color or creed. So for me, the two are linked. If we are locked in as one nation, why was it so jarring, so surprising for all of us, and myself included, what happened in July? We know it's very well documented, the failures of the intelligence agencies, the finger pointing, but just as every single one of us as individuals, why did it take us so much by surprise? Why do you think?
I don't think anybody should have been surprised by what happened in July. For years, I've been saying we are headed for our own spring, the same way as we had the Arab Spring. And the tragedy with the Arab Spring is the same tragedy we are going to face. That it's a spontaneous revolt by the people. And it is not channeled in any way, and it is not organized in any way. People just burst out in anger. And as a result, for example, with Libya, for example, it just crumbled because it was not organized, it wasn't thought out, and that's exactly what we are doing now. We are playing with the anger of the people. And when it bursts, we will then pretend again that it's a surprise. Walk anywhere in South Africa and feel the anger that is boiling. It's frightening. And nothing is being done about it. That is a problem that I have at this point, that we are not listening, we are not feeling. Thanks.
Just allow me to follow up on that question. Tsepiso was speaking about how through the Sowetan they were empowering communities to solve their own problems. Is this a testament of how out of touch we as the media are then, if you're saying what you're saying?
I'm suggesting that it's a problem with society itself. And the journalism is a reflection of what our society is.
Jerome?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Ntate Thloloe. I agree with Ntate Thloloe in the sense that it shouldn't have been a surprise if you look at history. Again, fortunately, my father has also become a teacher to me through reading his writings, his articles, and his columns. And just through the yearning that I have to learn more about him, I've been exposed to the history of the country because, of course, he was a journalist and a voracious reader. And in my readings, I've picked up that there have been a series of violent outbursts in South Africa, looking even back from 1960, the 21st of March, Sharpeville. That was an outburst that people were revolting against the passes. It happened again, if you look at 1976, with children being murdered in the streets in Soweto by the police. It happened again if you look at 1977, Black Wednesday, which of course we do commemorate later on this month. And your pamphlets have got details of those commemorative events that we'll be having with a series of organizations to celebrate the day when Ntate Thloloe and many journalists, editors, and activists stood up to fight against apartheid. You had another violent outburst that happened then in 1984 in the Vaal Triangle that saw many people killed. It happened again in the 1990s. And I think what we can pick up from all these violent outbursts is exactly what Ntate Thloloe is talking about. When people are not being listened to, when people are not being heard, it goes back again to that message that he gave us, that we should be on the side of the downtrodden, make sure that people's grievances are heard. And I think Ntate Klaaste also wrote about a holding of an angry breath in the black community. I myself live in Soweto, and I've seen this happen a number of times where we've had African national-owned spaza shops being destroyed, being attacked by people who live with them, their neighbors. And there is this tension again in our community that something horrible is about to happen. And if we pay attention, things are getting worse. July was just another step. Unless something drastic is done, unless we do something like what Ntate Klaaste did in their time when they launched nation building, we will be facing a wasteland. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. If anybody else would like to add to this, and I would just like to say, Ntate Thloloe, when I'm listening to you talk about the Arab Spring as an example, I was one of the election observers in Egypt in 2012. What was heartbreaking was the fact that a year before we'd seen this uprising, but the political party representativity did not reflect that. The number of youth participants who were contesting the elections were minuscule, if not negligent, including female contestants. And I would even say participants. The media itself was very divided according to the political parties, but there's also oppression of the media. But when you say this would happen here, I ask myself the question, what happens after July? Jerome here is saying it seems as if we're still heading towards the eye of the storm. What can be done through journalism? Anton, if you would, Professor Harber, if you'd like to continue along this line or add something else, as you as well, Tsepiso. I do have a question here. We'll get to that. Yeah, and you, Tsepiso?
I thought maybe one element that is missing is where journalists are located. I think the change in society is something that we sometimes undermine. The change in society and the way we live has also meant that people who do journalism no longer live in those communities that are directly affected by poverty. So we know these problems exist, but we tend to sometimes underestimate the level of anger that Jerome is talking about. So when when July happened, it looks like it is a surprise, but it's precisely because most of the time we are not in those communities, we're not listening, we're not looking at the signs.
So your response is a good precursor to this question. It says, in practical terms, what does the phrase nation building mean for publications, and what can publications do to bring it to reality? If you could please answer that question. It was on the back of what you were talking about, and I know if you have something to say as well.
Well, it's a difficult one. Especially in the space that I've been in and where I'm at, where you look at basically the crisis that we've been facing as media organizations in terms of fewer staff, cutting of resources. It becomes difficult to do more than just your basic job of reporting. But I would say that even in reporting, these values that the panel has been talking about need to be infused, where we just looking at, okay, how does what we do assist in building a better country, building a better nation. So even when this debate that has been going on right now over the posters in KZN, I felt that the focus has been too much on the political party that came up with the posters and what it means for the party and the fallout there, but less about what it means about the conversation that South Africans should be having about whether we've reached a stage where we now going to our little corners, everyone is defending their space, instead of saying there is a broader agenda here that is set out in our constitution, which is to build one nation.
Anna, would you like to chip in?
Yes, I mean, I 100% agree with Ntata Joe and Jerome that the incidents in July weren't really a surprise and that there probably are more to come. And I think the media should be more responsible and play a preemptive role, because actually the media is often part of the problem, if we're honest. Many articles in the mainstream media, and this has been going on for decades, they denigrate the lived experiences of working class communities and impoverished communities, and that causes further alienation. And part of this is when journalists aren't actively encouraged to be on the side of the downtrodden, then you don't get those stories being regularly covered. I covered a story last week or the week before where the municipality dug a huge trench and burst a water pipe, and a very deep pool formed, and a young boy drowned in it the next day. And I noticed that some of the publications covering it were not focusing on the fact that the municipality had completely failed in its duty to adhere to proper health and safety practices. They hadn't posted a guard there, they hadn't drained the water, but they then denigrated the nearby community of shack dwellers, saying people shouldn't have let their children go near that pool. So I think there need to be changes in the way in which journalism is practiced. Another thing I've picked up on with young new journalists is, and this is probably because of downsizing, and there aren't many section editors left in newsrooms, and there aren't many senior journalists left, but they're not being mentored properly. They're very channeled towards the pursuit of hard news all the time, to the extent where they get very mixed up about what is a story in the public interest and what isn't. So I've heard young journalists saying that they won't do a story of an 80-year-old bedridden woman in a township who has a municipal sewage leak, which has, is not her fault. It has nothing to do with her. It's 100 meters away from her house, but the sewage is flooding into her house, and she's stuck in her bed because she's bedridden with the sewage all around her. And these young journalists won't do that story because they say, well, that story has been done before. There's nothing new about that story. Can't do the same story all the time, even though it's a completely different person in a different community. And I think, what I pick up from them is they get more affirmation from their editors if they reporting on maybe a factional squabble in the ANC, and that's something new that hasn't been in the newspaper yet. Whereas that's not really very important, what one ANC member is saying about another, but they don't get that encouragement and affirmation when it comes to these stories of the people who Untitled and Jerome are describing as the downtrodden. So I do think the practice of journalism has to change. And I'm not just saying this because I work at New Frame, but I think New Frame, Ground Up, and those social justice publications they have brought something a bit new into the space. But then the problem is that being online publications, nobody really out there who is impoverished can read them, because I know I do a lot of stories about farm workers, and I go to a place where there might be 50 farm workers living, and they say, this is the first time a journalist has been here in 90 years, because sometimes people will show you their IDs and show you how old they are. They'll say, we've never seen a journalist here. But then, you have to print the stories out and go back and drop them off, because not one person there will have a smartphone, so not one person can read it. So there's a lot of different factors intersecting. And I think we're in a kind of a bad situation now, because we've got millions of people who don't have access to the news at all. At the same time, we've got papers like Sowetan that have historically been accessed very well, but they're cash strapped. And so they're not probably just reaching the 2 million people a day that they used to reach in the 90s and early 2000s. So this might require, a group of people like the panelists you have in Joburg, very senior people, to do some regular brainstorming about how the media can actually shift the direction that distribution and publication and journalism is going in. I think that might be a bit useful, though I haven't applied my mind to it properly. Thanks.
Professor Harber, I'd like to go back to something that you were talking about. You're talking about bias, you're talking about divisions. And I suppose to continue the train of thought about how can not only publications but journalists practically embody these values. We've seen that in the newsrooms, because it's spilled over online, accusations amongst journalists, directed at journalists, being labeled all kinds of things, judging their kind of journalism. There's been talk of cabals, etc., etc. And I think it's a very important thing to talk about, because I also do think that sometimes as journalists we do we're immovable in our direction, or thinking of the direction of the kind of journalism that we take, not because of the environment as in the institution, but maybe how or whom we socialize with. So what are practical examples for journalists to embody these values, to be true to the ideal of one nation? And there are journalists here, by the way, who are sitting in the back. So please, I would like to hear from you as well, because we must talk about it if we are going to improve the lot of those who are going to come ahead.
Can I suggest that Martin talk about the old form of journalism, Martin Mashaba, where we would be in the train with the masses going into Soweto every day and coming back into town. And these days when journalists knock off, they get into their cars and they drive to the northern suburbs. They don't know what, I think that's what you were saying, they don't know about life in the gutters. So the journalism reflects that separation that has happened. Can I ask Martin to talk about those days?
Can I ask Professor Harber to just respond first, and Dr. Thloloe, and then we'll get to Martin, please.
So I'm not going to directly respond, but I'm going to pick up on what was said, but that I think deals with what we're dealing with. We do have to acknowledge that radio and television reach over 90% of our population. So newspapers don't. Newspapers never did. Online doesn't. It has the much greater potential to. but it doesn't because we are such an unequal society and we know the impediments. So what does that tell you? It tells you how important our public broadcaster is. And I'm sure you're pleased to hear that. Because the truth is that the vast majority of South Africans, and almost all of them, get their news from radio and television, which is dominated by the public broadcaster. So it tells you that we really, if we want to grow the information flow and the debate and awareness and knowledge and everything that goes with it, the strength, capacity, and the ability of our public service broadcaster to be a true public service broadcaster, which is about public service, because we all know that it is also constrained by commercial issues and problems and values, is to me the first question one has to ask. We have seen the emergence, the growing emergence and role in many countries, but here too, of non-profit journalism. And you mentioned New Frame and Ground Up as examples of them, and there are other examples in investigative journalism, Mambungani, and health journalism, Becca Sizwe, and others. I think playing an increasingly important role precisely because funded, they might have constraints on their funding, but they are less constrained by commercial considerations in the way you were describing how we have to give advertisers the audiences they want. So there are interesting and important developments that we have to support. We know community media, particularly community radio, is in trouble. I mean, never mind community newspapers, of which dozens closed during COVID. You know, community radio is the organic source of the, or is or should be, of the kind of journalism you're saying we need more of. Journalists who live and work and breathe the air of that community. We have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? Do we do enough to grow them, support them, make sure they succeed? Because it seems to me that the way news works is that very often it's something very local that can best tell you a story, that then gets picked up by the regional publication or broadcaster, that then gets picked up by the national, sometimes by the international. You know, when I was very troubled by what I thought was the inability of much of the media, not all, much of the media to help us understand what was happening in July, particularly thinking about Durban and Phoenix. I was saying, what is going on here? And I will say, some of the best coverage was in Sunday Times. It's not often I praise the Sunday Times, but I sometimes do, and in New Frame. You know what I did? I went and I looked at the local newspapers. I said, they're the ones who should be best placed, have people who know these communities or who live in them. I went to our 2 Durban local papers, and I was devastated. The coverage was it just wasn't there, and where it was poisonous. It was playing up the racial tension and division in a way that made me say, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Now we have to confront these issues. We have to deal with the fact that if we want this to happen, we've got to start, I think, with these elements I'm talking about where you know, I'm sounding down, but I think there's a lot of cause for hope. There's a lot of good journalism. We just have to nurture, give it the space, encourage it, give it the resources, make it happen.
Thank you, Professor Harber. And interesting thing is also what people define as journalism. Sometimes journalists or people who are broadcasters or people who are celebrities, the labels get confused, and I think that's also part of the problem, that the work of journalism then doesn't get done. Martin, Ntate Martin Kerongwe.
Good day, everybody. My name is Martin Matlaba. I worked with Mr. Joe Thloloe in the 60s. We started almost about the same time, although different years, and Aggrey Klaaste too. So in our days, we used trains, buses. Taxis were not so much. So in those means of transport, you heard people talking about what was happening in their neighborhoods. Maybe meetings that were held by a few neighbors and so on about something. That was the source of the story. And then you would also hear about somebody who has done something which was of very helpful towards the community and so on, or somebody who has sent somebody's child to school and so on. That was the story. These days, it seems most of our journalists just go to Google. They write something and you read the story in the newspaper and wow. You feel, okay, this person has no idea what he's writing about. And you throw the paper aside, which is where circulation comes in. And the name of the newspaper also goes down. We don't read. By reading, okay, we would also pick up certain things from there, and that went on with our newspapers. I think I would say that much for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ntate Martin. Is there anybody else who would like to share experiences, thoughts? Thank you very much.
Afternoon, everybody. My name is Pagama Mbonambi. I'm a journalist. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Klaaste family, Mama Caroline, Jerome, Peter, and the AKT trustees. I know the journey that you've been on. We've had so many coffees and we've cried together, consoled each other. Well done for having the vision. My question is, what advice can you give another young South African who has a dream like you had to honor your father? What can they do? What's required to set up something like AKT? Thanks.
Thank you, Pagama. And Swaki, let's just get a question or comment from you as well.
Hi. Thank you, Tsepiso Makwetla. It's great to see you. I haven't seen you since we last worked together at the SABC. My question and maybe an observation is, I think that Thloloe and Professor Anton Harber also mentioned the, in passing what some of our challenges are as young journalists. I think it's easy when you are sitting on the other end and you've experienced the journalism of the previous days where journalists lived in communities. Life has happened, and what happened was came the internet, and that came with a lot of influences of influencers are becoming journalists, and we are competing with people who aren't journalists on the basis of also trying to get our stories out there. And yes, one of our biggest challenges is getting funding. Even us as community radio level, the volunteers have had so many pressures that it's so difficult for them to do what we were doing previously. When I started volunteering at a community station, I was staying at home and going into that community radio station 17 years ago. But some of the volunteers now who are getting into journalism are not necessarily staying at home. They are staying within the city, and life is expensive in the city, so they will do anything to just try to make things work. I think what we are missing is a kind of an organized way of getting the younger journalists getting into the industry and trying to grow as journalists, to be in touch with the more experienced journalists. We don't have a lot of knowledge sharing and experience and, like some kind of skills training and development focusing on the journalists that are at community level. And this doesn't happen because there isn't much funding. And even when we do it through Wits, Verse of Wits, and we partner up with the Wits School of Journalism, and we partner up with the Wits School of Governance, for example, to host a workshop for community journalists. We're hosting it online. It means that all of the other journalists who are out in the community who don't have access to internet will not have access to this medium and will not learn these skills. So we empower those who are already empowered. And I don't know if the answer is as simple as let's take the resources and what we have into the communities, or how do we bring those people on? And I think, again, our challenge is that there is a lack of empathy when we are telling stories. As Anna Majavu was saying, that what's the story going to do for me? Telling another story of a Magogo who's struggling, what's that going to do for me? And I think perhaps to Anton Harber's point is we don't need journalists that are going to be, that will not have feelings and emotion and will not have a standpoint on stories. Not politically, but have some level of empathy when telling stories and say, I'm a journalist and I'm an activist first, like Thloloe. I think that's something that's missing, and I don't know if there's a way we can teach it at Wits to the students that are joining in, because I think it does, it is informed largely by where we come from as a people and where we are looking to get into. And maybe we are going to get to that place, seeing that there are so many challenges and what, little protests happening there, that will inspire a kind of journalism that we might need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ntsaki. So if I could just please get my panelists to respond, and if you still have anything further that you'd like to pursue, or maybe by way of closing, because we are ending the program. But let's get comments to what has been said first, and then I'll give you about 2 minutes each for closing statements. Thloloe, shall we start with you?
The fascinating thing about this session we've had today is that we have seen a 180 or 360 degree view of journalism and the role of journalism. And it looks like there are various issues that need to be attended to. I would suggest to Jerome, this is probably one area that the trust should be looking at, getting a colloquium where all the elements of the problem can be discussed and threshed out until we emerge with some sort of solution at the end of it.
Thank you, Ndate. Definitely, I agree with you again there, Ndate. I mentioned earlier on that later on this month we will be commemorating Black Wednesday, and of course annually the Aggrey Klaaste Trust does host the Aggrey Klaaste annual colloquium in partnership with Wits, in partnership with DM5 Incorporated, in partnership with SANEF and the Sowetan as well. And we look at issues that are facing the media industry, but we also look at pressing issues facing society, because of course, as you mentioned again, that the issues facing the media are societal issues. We'd be more than happy to look at what we can do next year, perhaps having an indaba of sorts where we have all members of the media present, alternative media, mainstream media, and the Wits and all the other schools of journalism to take part in that. I wanted to also respond to my dear brother Phakama Mbonambi, who's raised a point about young people who would like to also follow this journey of trying to keep a legacy alive. For me, as I mentioned, it was quite difficult, but I was very fortunate because my father was a very special man, and he touched a lot of people's lives. And I say that quite easily because every time I pick up the phone to try and to get someone to meet with us, they're happy to do so because they remember him. And I know that they're helping us because they respected and loved him. One of the major things that has helped my journey is reading. I've had to read my father's work, because you can't speak about Aggrey Klaaste if you don't know what he was all about, and to get his true voice on what nation building was about and the issues that were facing our country back then and still facing today. So I would say to young people, the biggest resource that you do have is the material around you to read. The internet is there. Make sure that you research. Make sure that you learn the subject matter as best as you possibly can. The next thing to do is to make sure you surround yourself with amazing people. I'm sitting between incredible people, and people that have been very, very great to us, very, very kind to us, mentored me, people who not only knew my father, but also believed in the same nation-building values that he had. And so I say to young people, again, it speaks to that intergenerational dialogue between us young people and people who are mature, so to speak. So I think young people, best thing to do is to make sure that you speak to your uncles, your grandmothers, your aunties, to find out how things were before, in order to get a holistic view of what is happening right now. I was fortunate again, Dad is a writer, I was able to read, and I was also able to sit at the feet of these amazing people. Thank you. Before you end off, Jerome, but what were the challenges specifically? Because I think it's also important to know, if there are those you don't want to necessarily, you can just skim over. But I think it's important, if you are advising young people along this path, what were the hindrances? Major one for me was that my father was a mammoth. His legacy was huge. So one was in that shadow. And you question yourself if you are worthy to even speak out loud about him and his legacy, because people will ask you, who are you? What doctorate do you have? Are you a professor of what again? And that happened to me, and it was a challenge. One ran away from this legacy for a very long time. But again, in sitting down to read more about what he was saying in his own words, speaking to people like Thloloe, Professor Harber, speaking to people like Madi, my mother as well, I was able to understand the meaning behind nation building. And once I understood the meaning behind it, I could not harbor any negative feelings towards it. And I could not reflect upon it negatively or as a failure towards my achievements, because he was such a great man. But then I was able to celebrate his achievements and follow in his footsteps and speak out loud and proudly to say, he was my father, he was a great man. And to speak about what made him great, nation building. And that again is all about caring for people, making sure we use his name as a platform to open doors for people in poor and needy communities. And which is why I love the Community Builder of the Year initiative, because it looks at communities that are far out. I mean, if you look at just the history of the Community Builder of the Year initiative, you had previous winners coming from rural areas in KZN, in Limpopo, in the Northern Cape. And some of these areas are areas that have been forgotten, which we need to shed the light on. So that was a difficult thing for me, was to read, to be honest, again, because reading my father's work was quite tough. His writing was highbrow, and he referred to a lot of things I knew nothing about in literature and in history as well. Just listening to you speak now about Egypt and Libya, I'm learning so much. And in the beginning, I had a very scant knowledge of world history, and reading about his work has taught me a lot, and that was a difficulty in it. I remember reading one article, the first article I read, it took me 45 minutes, and that's a lot. That's a lot of time. But as time went on, it got better. And the reason why it took so long is that I had to consult a dictionary every second word. I had to find out what a certain phrase meant, a phrase like chicken jowl, or a phrase like mink and manure, phrases like downtrodden. These are things that I had to learn, and it was a painful process, but it is also a rewarding process. Thanks. Thank you for sharing that, Jerome. Professor Harber?
So let me say, what he's underplaying is how persistent he and his family have been. I mean, a critical factor here is that he's stuck with it in the last couple of years. And so a great deal of credit lies to him and the family with him and behind him. I mean, what you say about reading is interesting because one's reminded that Aggrey was a very well-read man, and the craft of writing was important to him. And we don't see enough of that in pushing out the news. The craft of writing was much more important in a lot of journalism then, and we see it less often now, and it's a pity. I want to end by saying that I think the nature of this conversation has shown how relevant that legacy is, and how important it is to remind ourselves that these are not new issues, new debates. There's a history of them that goes back a long time. And the point made about the history of journalism, and particularly the history of black journalism in this country, is an important one. I think there should be a push. It's very good that you're documenting what your father wrote and stuff written about him. There should be a project to remind us, to record and make available to young people and students the rich history of black journalism in this country, in particular. You know, the Majavus and the Plaatjies and the Dubes, and there is a lot about the drum generation. That's a good thing, but the other eras also. You could give a string of other names that are not as well documented and recorded as they should be. So I think that is an important point.
Tsepiso?
Yeah, when Jerome is talking about using the articles to learn new words, just reminded me when we were growing up that a newspaper was as critical as a school teacher to us. So that's what you would do. I had a friend who will keep pies and pies of Sowetan and the New Nation, just learning new words that he will go and use in meetings to impress other students, because he had big political terms that he was using. So there are other rules that journalism play beyond just maybe giving you news. So it's been great being here. I think it's also helping on my part in terms of thinking about what we do, because when you are in the middle of deadlines, running, chasing stories every day, sometimes you don't sit back to think about actually what's the bigger vision here. And I think this conversation, if it continues, it will assist in that regard, and I hope that it involves more media houses in terms of discussions, not just because Klaaste was associated with the Sowetan, but the media industry as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could, have you all said what you wanted to say? Or would you like an extra minute to round off that, Thloloe? You're good? Okay. So
I would like, thank you, ma'am. I would like to thank you again for your support and just ask you to please join us later on this year. As I mentioned, we're having that commemoration for Black Wednesday. We're doing it in partnership with over 14 organizations in the media and in the community, in the media community and the Black consciousness community. And it looks at how we celebrate the day of Black Wednesday. But importantly, I must note that that day was a dark day, not just for the media, but for the country in general. And it is a day that we use to reflect on what happened on those days. So please do join us. You've got the pamphlets there, they've got a timetable. We'll be running events from the 18th of October, 19th and the 20th of October that look at this important event in our history. And they are, of course, important because they are under one umbrella, and the single umbrella there is called Nation Building Conversations with Each Other. So it is important to mention that when we're launching Nation Building, that the highlights that are coming up are those events. Thank you.
thank you, Jerome. This is, do we have a question or? Okay. We're a little late for questions, but I'm so generous.
I've been sitting and contemplating.
Thank goodness the spark has been lit.
Thank you. This is to Jerome. Firstly, just greetings to everyone. It's such an honor to be in such a wealth of knowledge room full of people. I just wanted to know, when it comes to the trust, do you have any Oh, my name is Pretty Ngwenya. I'm so sorry. My name is Pretty Ngwenya, and I am a broadcaster at VOW FM. I just wanted to know, Buti Jerome, if you have any voluntary positions that you have, because I feel like it's always so important to surround yourself with people that are where you want to be or where would you like to be in particular. So when it comes to the trust, are there any voluntary positions that people can engage in, especially with the youth?
Thank you so much for that. And perhaps if I could just read some of the communication that's been coming through online as well. We've got Tsepiso Makwetla, who says it's difficult to embody the principles entailed in Aggrey Klaaste's Manifesto of nation building because of various factors that affect how we approach journalism over the past decades. Newsrooms have been stripped bare as a result of the changing landscape. He says one of the most influential dynamics is the lack of old school journalists who have institutional memory specific to journalistic challenges. These journalists, the breed that have first-hand and lived experiences in connection to Aggrey Klaaste's ideals, we no longer have these journalists present in newsrooms. In addition, newsrooms are thin and journalists are spread beyond their capabilities, resulting in prioritizing sexier stories rather than stories that speak to the communities that we write for. So that was Tsepiso Makwetla. And Pindile Klaba says to you, thank you, Jerome, and the Aggrey Klaaste Trust for persevering the nation-building spirit. We need more of it today. Thank you very much for that. And sorry, this is called right. I think this is where my journey ends, and at the end of this, before or after the vote of thanks, please know that there is a room that we can go up to for some eats or treats. Makwetla will show us where, but after, yes, you, I don't want to get strong. Let me please call Lerato Matopo, who is a director, partner of the Dispute Resolution and Investigation Department at DMS, to give a vote of thanks. Thank you so much for staying with us and being part of the conversation. I'm sure you've got quite a lot of material to work on. From me, thank you very much for your indulging me.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Tsepiso has said, my name is Lerato Matopo. I'm from DM5 Incorporated, and I've been tasked with the vote of thanks. And as you can see, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. I feel like I'm in the company of great people. I'm not a media practitioner. I'm not even a media lawyer. So for me, it's been interesting just to listen what media practitioners think about media. Some of my criticism have been toned down a bit. I'm a bit sympathetic now to some of the challenges that media deals with. Yesterday I was thinking about what am I going to say, But I remember, I'm not a big TV watcher, but I remember why I always enjoyed watching the Community Builder of the Year. And for me, what always fascinated me about it was that the winners were ordinary people. It had nothing to do with qualification. It had nothing to do with anything. All you required was a willingness to do something to help people. And I think we've lost quite a bit of that. We all think that for you to be a community builder, you need a degree, you need money, you need to be from that family or that family. And I'm hoping that what we will take away from this is that for you to be a community builder or contribute to nation building, you just need the willingness to help the next person. That is all. You don't even need to know how to register a public benefit organization. You will figure that out along the way, as Jerome has had to figure, as he had to figure it out. And that's part of the reason why we as DM5 are excited by our partnership with AKT, because for me it's a reminder that all of us need to do a little bit just to make the next person's life better. So on the vote of thanks, I'd like to thank the panelists for fruitful discussion. I'd like to thank all the participants, the people that are here streaming physically. Thank you very much on behalf of the AKT. And I thought I'll thank our partners, SANEF, DM5, Vets Journalism, Sowetan, Steve Biko Foundation, Institute of Advancement of Journalism, Media Monitoring, UNISA, Freedom of Expression Institute, The Forge, Cape Town Press Club, National Press Club, University of Johannesburg, Sol Plaatje University, and the Human Rights Commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Just to give us directions on where we can get refreshments and restrooms.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please follow me. We are going to have lunch upstairs.